Well, this is for Wednesday night, May the 20th, and welcome to Wednesday night service. And this is at our house, so welcome to our house, virtually anyway. And lived here with my wife Sherry for 30 years in this neighborhood and Howard subdivision, so kind of welcome here. And tonight we're going to pick up where Adam and Kinsey left off. They were in Proverbs 3. And we're going to pick up the next two verses, which is 7 and 8. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. If you want to turn there, you can follow along. It's pretty short, but kind of a lot of stuff here. So let me just read it. It says, "Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and shun evil. This will bring health to your body and nourishment to your bones." So this is an interesting combination of three separate things. Wisdom, not from yourself kind of wisdom, but from God. Fear the Lord and good health. And Solomon is combining all three of those in this two verses. And while that's interesting, you might actually know that this is sort of a theme in the Old Testament. He's not the only one who said this before. Job said this very same thing. Job, probably the oldest book in the Old Testament, and he said this. And if you were to look in chapter 28, verse 28, you can see that he said, "And he said unto the human race, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding." So, yeah, so Solomon, Job both said the same thing, so kind of like, what's up with that? And so let me just give you the first quick thought just from my own personal application. We'll call this level 1, and then we'll take it up a couple levels after this. That'll be more important. So here's level 1, just from my own personal point of view, right? Fear and something good coming from fear. May not know, might know. I was involved in the Terre Haute Triathlon for 25 years and still going on. I've done it and been a participant in it about a dozen times, and Sherry and I were the race directors for 10 years, so we actually put the race on. And then for the last few years, Ethan Page has taken it over and just worked as a volunteer. So I've seen it from just about every way possible, and the most interesting part of the whole race, at least the fear part for me, is the swim. I'm a very average swimmer. I can get a little fearful in there sometimes, as you can imagine. If you've been at the Hawthorne Park Lake and you've seen it, it's a pretty murky little place. And it's a half-mile swim, open water, and there's generally 200 people, sometimes as many as 300 people in that race. And so you're swimming in quite the crowd, even though we tend to go in waves, and nowadays you go two at a time, but back in the day where mostly when I did it, it was 40 or 50 people at a shot. So being a middle of the pack swimmer, I'm generally swimming around other people, and if you get out there little waves, you sort of finally get into your groove and you relax a little bit, and then you bump into somebody, or you'll come up to the turn buoy and there's a crowd there, and you're trying to get around the crowd at the same time you're trying to turn, and it's 30 feet deep below you, and it's just you and your swimming ability, and it can get a little scary, to be quite honest with you. It can be downright fearful. And been in that situation a number of times, not just at Hawthorne Park Lake, but other ones just like it. Rivers, oceans, and swimming in the open water with a lot of people, it's a kind of a crazy thing. So with that fear in mind, every winter, without fail, I'd march over across campus. I work at Indiana State University. Walking across campus, I would go to the Tyree Pool. And Tyree Pool, if you've never seen it, was built in 1940. I looked it up, and it looked older than that. And so if you've been in Tilson Auditorium, this is actually in the basement right underneath Tilson Auditorium. And it's not the prettiest pool, and it certainly wasn't the very warm pool. So as you can imagine, walking across campus in the winter is cold, and then getting into a cold pool takes some resolve to do that. But the resolve was for a good reason. And so for about 3 times a week, all winter, all early spring, year after year, I'd make that little march over there and jump in the pool and swim on my lunch hours. Like I said, about 3 times a week. So, and I did it because I knew that when I came up to those turn buoys and I'm in a crowd and I have to turn and, you know, you're out there a quarter mile from shore, you don't want to be thinking about, I don't have the ability to do this. I didn't practice enough. I wasn't prepared. You want to be prepared for that, please. So, yeah, that's how I see it. Fear, producing good things, actually producing some good health based off of that. So that's just a personal kind of a thing that I learned from it. And you're probably thinking, why would you do such a stupid thing? You're smarter than that, right? I'm not necessarily. So anyway, just being honest. And so that's kind of level 1 for me. And then let's take it to level 2 here. Let's kind of hop into the elevator and take it up a big notch. Well, just a short little take here in between level 1 and level 2. I thought you might want to know us just a little bit better. You know Adam, you know Brett. You may not know me quite as well. So one little interesting tidbit is Sherry and I are grandparents for the first time. And some interesting things happen in the first time when you do this that I never thought about, but, you know, it come into play. Was what do you call yourself? You know, in the old days, it was grandpa and it was grandma, and that's kind of how it was. Not today so much. The ladies especially like to call themselves something besides grandmother. So, you know, as Sherry was deliberating this, she was kind of working on different names, and so they kind of asked me the same question, and I'm working on the same name myself. And so I kind of came up with one based on what my son calls me, my youngest son, Jacob. He calls me Pops. And so as Pops, I thought, well, what if you call me Big Pops? Because Big Pops fits me, right? Not so much. But anyway, it's good fun. And so I'm trying to get him to call me Big Pops. And just sort of as a running joke. Anyway, so in Sherry's case, she thought of the name Mimi. And I've heard Mimi from other ladies at church specifically, and I think Lori Miller goes by Mimi. So Lori Miller and Papa Bear, you know, that's Doug and Lori Miller, and so affectionately known as, at least to their closest ones. And so she came up with this idea. She wanted to be Mimi. So I thought Mimi and Big Pops doesn't really go together, so I kind of came up with a nickname for her, just myself. And so don't tell her, but I came up with a nickname for her, and I call her Big Mama. Well, she doesn't really like Big Mama, so don't tell anybody. Okay, so let's take it up to level 2 into something that's a little more meaty than my lack of swimming ability. Okay, so here on the second floor, talk about a guy named Blaise Pascal, and you may or may not have heard of Blaise Pascal. Not the most famous guy, but in some ways, yes, he is. So, Blaise was a French mathematician, physicist, inventor, writer, and a Catholic theologian, and he had a lot of science behind him. Got into economics, other things too. Child prodigy by the age of 16. He was just an incredibly smart guy. A lot of interesting history behind him. But, you know, in 1642, still as a teenager, he did some pioneering work on calculating. And he came up with the first calculator, a mechanical calculator. He had like 50 different prototypes. He finally came out with one that worked. He built a bunch of them. And he was an amazing mathematician and figured out how to do things that nobody had done before him. And so, quite a smart guy. Well, something happened to Blaise. in 1654. It really totally changed his life. And the verses that we're talking about tonight, Proverbs 3, 7, and 8, he just sort of put it into play and into practice really, really well. This came into play in his life, specifically this one night. Supposedly it was a night in November, and something happened to him where he got a vision. And in this vision, he wrote it down, and he actually, when he wrote this down, he sewed it into the pocket of his jacket, and this jacket he kept and he wore for the rest of his life. So whatever happened to him in this vision, it's a pretty big deal. So for a guy who was like one of the smartest scientists of his era, became much of a theologian after that. And so he wrote a couple of very interesting books, one of which I've read bits and pieces of. It's called Pensives. And Pensives, of course, is an odd name, of course it's French, and it just means thoughts. So he wrote down his thoughts. And his thoughts had a lot to do with Christian religion and the thoughts behind it, and God, and not trusting in his own wisdom, but in God's wisdom, even though he was one of the smartest people of his era. And so one of the most fascinating things about him is he came up with this thing called Pascal's Wager. It became known as Pascal's Wager. And so if you've never heard of Pascal's Wager, here it is. And so it definitely relates to our verses for tonight. And it's basically saying, if a person was to set down a wager with his life, which is what everyone is doing, may or may not realize that, but your life, you're making a massive wager. And that wager is whether you believe in God, the God of the Bible, Jesus Christ, or you don't. Because think about this. If you believe in Jesus Christ, what you would do with your life is different than what you did if you didn't. So, and then the person who doesn't believe in Christ, who doesn't trust him as your Savior, you're going to live by your own wisdom and do what you think is right. And you build your life off your own framework. So, but that's really a massive gamble, if you will. Let's think about this. So if you're a Christian and just say you give money to the church, you spend a lot of time helping other people, you're looking after your neighbor where otherwise you probably wouldn't. What do you have to lose? Well, you could probably lose a few things. There's some pleasures in life, there's some luxuries that you're going to have to give up. And hey, just being honest. So, but they're actually, in the whole scheme of things, it's pretty small, if you will. Those little luxuries, those little pleasures, and you give them up to help somebody else, well, it's not really a big thing. Think about this now. If you rejected God and you rejected Christ, think about the wager that you're doing. If God exists, and he really does exist, and you stand before God at the end of this time, and your life is over, and you bet your whole fortune on him not existing, and he does, what have you lost? Well, as you stand in front of God, you've lost everything. If there is a hell, and you've rejected God, well, the consequences are massive. Put this in modern day terms. You sell everything that you have, you put together everything in a big lump of cash, put it in your wallet, and you fly to Las Vegas. And you walk up to the roulette wheel. In the roulette wheel, you can play black or you can play red. There are other ways to play it, but let's just say that you put it all on one color or the other. And so you put it all on black. Everything that you own, every piece of cash, it's all tied into a 50-50 wager. The wheel spins, you put the ball on there, it comes out, and it turns out red. Well, you've lost everything. Okay? So let's say you bet the other way, and you won everything, a massive thing. Same kind of concept, but instead of cash, this is eternity we're talking about. If this is Pascal's Wager, what you've risked is your whole eternity. If you turn down God, the chances are you haven't turned just a little thing. You haven't turned cash. You've turned your whole eternity. And suppose God doesn't exist. What have you really lost? Not much. What have you lost if God does exist? Well, you've lost everything. And Pascal learned this. He understood it, and he knew what this wager really was. And that's why, science is one thing, but in eternity with God was a whole nother. And Pascal changed from being a really smart, incredibly gifted man, mathematician, economist, and the like, and to someone who became very much a theologian and who wrote down these thoughts in this book. And highly recommend it, especially if you think about it in terms of what exactly is Pascal's Wager and what it has to do with fear of God. Well, if you bet wrong, the fear of God is a big deal. So you may be asking this question. Solomon, Job, Old Testament figures, Old Testament verses, how does this apply in the New Testament? Does it even apply at all? Sure it does. Well, let me just give an example. So, both the Apostle Paul and Jesus' words talk about standing before God and giving an account. So, like it or not, all of us at some point are going to have to stand before God and give an account. Now, if you're like what Blaise Pascal said, and you made a good bet that you trusted in God and you did what you could to live a good life, to follow Him, to be saved, to be a good servant, you're going to be in good shape. However, the fear of the Lord is going to come in if you didn't do those things. And you're going to stand before God and give an account, and it's not going to go well. You're not going to like the outcome of what's going to happen. And fear of the Lord and trusting in your own wisdom at that point, well, you can see what a terrible mistake possibly you could have made. So just to make sure that you understand where that comes from in the New Testament, I thought I'd read a few verses and you can sort of catch my drift here. And I'll start with 2 Corinthians 5:10. So it says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may receive his due for the things done in the body, whether good or bad." From Jesus' words, here's Matthew 12:36. "But I tell you that men will give an account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken." Matthew 16:27. "For the Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will repay each one according to what he has done." And then Jesus goes on and he gives us parable, the sheep and the goats, and you're probably well familiar with this, but I'll read it. It's in Matthew 25, and it's in verses 31 through 46. And this is where Jesus is going to separate it into one or two groups, those who are saved and those who are not. And keep that in mind as we go through this here. So starting in verse 31. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on the right, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.' Then the righteous will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did you see a stranger and invite you in, or need clothes and clothe you? When did we see you ill or in prison and go to visit you?' And the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.' Then he will say to those on the left, 'Depart from me, for you are cursed, into eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you didn't invite me in. I needed clothes, you didn't clothe me. I was ill and in prison, you didn't look after me.' They will answer, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothing, or ill, or in prison, and did not help you?' He will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me.' And they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." Think about that. Standing before God is someday. Fear of the Lord, trusting in your own wisdom, it's going to become so real, so important, so fast. So we're about to end our time here, and sort of as you exit our home, the foyer here, I got this piece of art from Arthur, Illinois. I saw it a few years ago, and as soon as I saw it, it reminded me of my mom and dad, and that they had made this trip to heaven about 7 years ago, and just sort of kind of had to have it. But it reminds me of something even bigger, a massive artwork, if you will, the epitome of Christian art. It's called The Last Judgement, and it's in the Sistine Chapel. And so if you go to Rome, of course you'd want to see the Sistine Chapel, and you'd want to see firsthand Michelangelo's The Last Judgement. It's among the most powerful renditions of Christian art ever, and 300 muscular figures in a variety of dynamic poses. Blows the mind. If you to look at it, to do a little research on it, you can see it for yourself. And unlike the scenes on the walls and the ceilings, the Last Judgement is not bound by any painted border. It's all-encompassing. It goes beyond the viewer's field of vision, and sort of reminds you of something. This has happened, something in the future. It's not like a painting of historical facts like most Christian art. This is something that's dynamically going to happen to each of the viewers. And so you sort of have to put yourself in this picture of Michelangelo's massive fresco here. And interestingly enough, Michelangelo painted his own face in this. And of all places, he painted it on the filleted skin of St. Bartholomew. And you may or may not know that story, but St. Bartholomew was said to have been filleted and skinned alive as an apostle for Christ and seeing the message that he brought. So there's this image of St. Bartholomew holding the skin, and it's in a very precarious position because down below, not far from where Bartholomew is holding the skin, is literally pictures of hell. And it's pictures of people getting kicked off a boat and down into the dungeons of hell, and it's really scary. And interestingly, you know why Michelangelo painted himself in this position. How did he consider himself in his role here, where his life was? Quite an interesting thing. You may or may not know the Eastern Orthodox Church has a painting like this on the back wall as you exit their churches, and it's made for the same reason Michelangelo painted this in the Sistine Chapel. So to remind you that you're in this view, and that as you walk out into the world and you go in your places, that there is a final judgment, and what you do on this earth and how you do it, what you say, it really all matters. And so that's pretty interesting about the Eastern Orthodox Church. So just another side fact from them, they believe there's 2 judgments, and one like within 40 days after you pass, the second one, the final judgment, when we all stand before Christ, and separating the sheep from the goats, if you will. So I don't know if they're right, if there's 2 judgments, if there's 1 judgment, or if there's 3 judgments. You can find opinions on all 3. But what really matters is there is a final judgment. 1, 2, 3. We're going to have to stand before God and give an account of our lives. What we did with this gift called life, and or what we didn't do. And so that's our future, like it or not. Okay. So as we sort of end this today, in this precarious position that Michelangelo painted himself, and we're trying to put ourselves in this thing. So as we attend service, wow, think about this. Greg Starkley recently repainted the entire sanctuary, and it's got a nice fresh coat of paint on it, and it's nice and pristine. What about an interesting time of, let's commission this Last Judgment on the back of First Baptist North. And as you walk out the door, you sort of see this massive painting, and you think, oh my gosh, where am I? Well, wouldn't that stir the Baptist community?